Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Shannon's Shelf. I am your host, Shannon. Hopefully, you don't hear my kids in the background. They're supposed to be sleeping, but they're not. Really, it sounds like. Uh, but today, I want to talk about someone who I've never read before, but I definitely going to be reading more of. Nikolai Berdyaev. And so he is a Russian philosopher and theologian. And I had never heard of him until only about a month or so ago when I had read The Dialectics of Myth by Alexei Losev, and I emailed the translator who teaches at Ohio University. And I made a video on that book, definitely worth checking out. I think that was super interesting. That's why I bothered emailing Professor Marchenkov about it. And he recommended this guy, since I'm interested in aesthetics. He doesn't really talk so much about mythology, philosophy of myth, or anything, but he does talk about art and certainly creativity. And Berdyaev is a very interesting guy. He actually wrote quite a bit, and a fair amount of it at least, is translated into English. As of today, I actually have started another book by Berdyaev that is Spirit and Reality. Lots of his books are stuff like that: Spirit and Reality, Slavery and Freedom, stuff like that. But the one I'm talking about today is The Meaning of the Creative Act. Now, I'm not going to go over it in too much detail. There's a lot crammed in here. It's a little over 300 pages. Not a super fast read, but also not the hardest philosophical writings I've read. If you've ever tried to read Hegel or even Losev, who I just read recently, this is way easier than that, I would say, at least. But to give a little background on Berdyaev, he is Russian. He was born in Kiev to a line of Russian nobility, essentially, and he didn't live lots of his life in Russia, especially when the Bolshevik Revolution happened. He was a Marxist, though, when he was in college, so he was aware of stuff like that, but that's not the philosophy he ended up settling on, necessarily. In fact, he's I've seen him called a personalist, which is kind of an in-between of the collectivist things like Marxism, but also the individualism of liberalism. And kind of in between, I've seen him called a Christian existentialist. Both of them seem relatively proper from what I've read, but I'm not exactly sure which one might be best. But either way, that's what he has been called, and he definitely has a theological tint to his writings. He definitely believes in God. Now, he prescribes to Russian Orthodoxy, and he thought it was the closest thing, like the best church, I guess you could find on earth, but he was still what would probably be considered a relatively liberal member of the Orthodox Church. Like, I think he was shaking the boat, maybe, in that regard. But one thing that you hear about in Christian apologetics and stuff like that, and so if you're acquainted with that stuff, you may have heard of something called a theodicy, or a justification of God. And the meaning of the creative act is meant to be Berdyev's anthropodicy, which is a justification of man. And he takes great interest in men, the humankind, essentially. And his philosophy is interesting. He's kind of anti-clerical. I feel like you can get mystical vibes from him, but he's definitely kind of his own thing. I feel like my understanding of personalism in many ways is lots of the big personalists kind of have their own unique brand of personalism. Berdyaev had this justification of man. He sees man as like a microcosm of God and like of the universe, essentially. And being related to God, the image of God, creation is a big thing, or should be a big thing. Theurgy is what he calls it, is that our creative acts should be things that go beyond our own world, necessarily, right? They should be, I guess in many ways, you should be creating really good, profound art, not necessarily just smut or what have you. That's not, and when he says creativity, he doesn't necessarily mean just art like paintings and stuff like that. Those chapters on the creativity with dealing with sexuality, and there is a chapter on art, redemption. Really, really interesting stuff. Some of the chapters I enjoyed more than others, but regardless. But he also would say that philosophy itself is a creative act. You're creating a new form of knowing. In fact, he goes on to say that philosophy tends to be too scientific, especially since the age. Well, I mean, he would probably say you probably say Aquinas was guilty of this too, and probably Aristotle. And then, since the age of the Enlightenment, we get so heavy-handed with the understanding of empiricism. There are some exceptions. Kant is less like that, and he thinks that philosophy should not be scientific because science is adapted to necessity, and necessity is the antinomy to freedom, and creativity is adapted to freedom. You do not create if you are not free, and I think that's simple enough to get behind. And so I just want to share, I guess, a little bit of the thoughts that I think that were interesting with that creativity in redemption. He had something I never thought about before, but I'm like, I kind of already agreed with. I felt like I got that a lot when I was reading this book. I was like, oh yeah, I agree with this. I've never been able to articulate it, but yeah, I get what you're saying. Some of it I was like, I have no idea what he's talking about. With that idea of redemption, that he was like, prophecy is kind of a spirit of creativity, or kind of a heart of creativity in many ways. And he asked something. If you can imagine with redemption, this is perhaps one of the more religious focused chapters. But he says this. I'll just read his own words. This might be a minute. Salvation or perdition are connected with man's moral perfection, but not with his aesthetic or perceptive perfection. By his religious moral perfection, man redeems his sin, becomes a participant in salvation, and wins eternal life. But can the same goal be reached by religious aesthetic or religious perceptive perfection? Can God refuse a man for his ugliness or want of knowledge if the man is morally perfect? Can man be refused because he does not create beauty or knowledge? Can man be saved and inherit eternal life by great accomplishments in beauty or knowledge? For man's eternal life, does God require only the moral man, or the aesthete and the knower? Every kind of perfection, and everything like the perfection of God, ontological, and not only moral perfection, all fullness of being, must be a participant in eternal life. And then he goes on to say that what Christianity has been up to this point, essentially, is saying no, it has to be the moral, the aesthetic, and the knowledge perception stuff has to submit to it, be subsumed. And he's saying we should do better than that. Like, redemption in the world is not supposed to be from something, but for something. Man is supposed to be more in this life, not just scared of sinning. He should be actively trying to be like God, not just by trying to not sin, but by actively creating. Creating is an upward thrust towards the heavens, essentially. And I think that can go in hand. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thought, at the very least. And one thing that's definitely a downer about this book, and kind of silly almost, that the fact that he was thinking about this seems quite naive, is he wrote this in 1914. And he thought he was writing on the edge, the precipice of this creative Christian epoch, that the world was going to get our collective heads out of our butts, and we were going to start being more creative and more turning towards God, but in the proper way that he understood it, which was, again, being more creative, not just hiding in our closets, worrying about sin and stuff like that. And that absolutely did not happen. At least not on the scale he thought it would be. Maybe someone could argue that it is happening in some ways, right? Maybe. But I think he commented after World War I and like the Bolshevik Revolution happened, and was saying that perhaps I was a little naive with my thinking it was going to happen so soon, but he was at least saying that it still needs to happen, is what I think what he kind of, calmed down a little bit, saying this is what we should be doing. And so you can take that as you will. And regardless, this philosophy of creativity, I find fascinating. I think that the Western tradition is kind of in a creativity crisis. And I've been against a lot of the modern Western stuff and some other Western stuff in general, not just because it's modern or postmodern or what have you. I couldn't quite pinpoint what it is, and I think I'm kind of being opened up into a new realm of thinking when it comes to this. And now I don't really want to share too much because I'm still kind of trying to figure out my thinking. But this was a very helpful book. It was kind of several wow moments as I was reading it. I feel like it's kind of a shame that he's not as well known, or if, I feel like I would perhaps have heard about him. Maybe not. I'm sure in certain circles he's very well known, but I mean, I'm a master's student in philosophy and I had never heard of him. But either way, I've been really enjoying reading these Orthodox writers, these Eastern Orthodox writers. I have a friend who's Eastern Orthodox. I have very little acquaintance with the Orthodox Church. I have no plans to become member of an Orthodox church or anything like that. But their way of viewing the world, even if they're perhaps more liberal than the average Orthodox churchgoer is so different than what I'm used to in the Western tradition that it is very refreshing. So I would recommend reading some Berdyaev yourself if you might enjoy that sense of refreshment. And I can definitely recommend The Meaning of the Creative Act, and hopefully I'll be making at least some video on him at some point as well, at least because I'm currently reading one of his other books that I already have. I got a cheap copy of. But either way, those are my thoughts. Hopefully you understood something from that, because that was not very encompassing. There would have been a lot to go over if I wanted to encompass it, but I gave you a little taste, I suppose. But please feel free to like and subscribe. Leave a comment with any of your thoughts. That would be appreciated. And hopefully that was coherent enough, and I will see you guys next time. Have a good one.